It is the 74th United Nations General Assembly and leaders are on stage to raise their concerns and views. While the main focus being Syria, all eyes are turned on US President Donald Trump and Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Can they put their differences aside to cooperate for peace in Syria? Will they overcome the crisis of the purchase of S-400 defense system from Russia? What about the refugee crisis at Turkey's doorstep? Well, I'm joined by Senior Advisor of Turkey's President Gulnur Aybet on One-on-One. So President Erdogan is in New York for the United Nations General Assembly at a time when relations are strained with the US following the purchase of the S-400 defense system from Russia, and it was excluded from the F-35 program. So what is the next step?
The next step, well, that's a very big question. With US-Turkish relations, I think we are going through a strained time, but at the same time, we've been allies for such a long time. And, you know, Turkey is a very important strategic ally and partner for the United States and vice versa. So both parties, despite the differences, are trying to sort out the problems. Of course, you mentioned the S-400. Now, that is one issue that the American side are putting forward. But it's also interesting when we look at the different voices coming out of the American government.
I mean, Trump did say Turkey was treated unfairly.
Exactly.
But is that a sign of negotiations?
Well, I mean, you mentioned President Trump's statement at the G20 in Osaka, and he was completely empathetic to the Turkish position. In fact, he reiterated the Turkish position on the issue and sympathized with our position on this issue. So whenever I talk to US officials, I say, well, President Trump, has already explained to you our position. Being the second largest army in NATO, it had a huge gap in its missile and defense requirements. And it's been trying to fulfill that gap for a very long time. Over the years, we've looked at very different options. As you know, we live in a very tough neighborhood. And so with the first Gulf War and then the 2003 Iraq War and then the Syrian War, and we have a big border with Syria. Every time there was an attack from across these borders where there's lots of trouble in our country, we asked for the Patriot deployments through NATO. But we find that this is not sufficient to meet our air and missile defense gap because already NATO has already declared this in various NATO statements that within the next few years, more than 30 countries in the region will acquire ballistic missile capability. So we're right in the middle of this very volatile, changing security environment with this huge gap in our defense systems. So we actually asked the Americans for the Patriot over 10 years ago, and the Obama administration didn't give it to us, and they sort of put the onus on Congress and all that. But after that, we looked at other options. For a while, we pursued the Chinese option. It wasn't satisfactory. Apart from fulfilling this missile and defense gap, we also have a requirement to build our own national defense industry, which we're doing actually quite rapidly and very successfully. Already 60% of our defense industry is fully nationalized now. So it's pretty obvious what we're looking for. We're looking to close this gap in our air and missile defense. We're interested in technology transfer, and we're interested in joint production because we're looking to build our defense industry. So none of the offers fulfilled this except the S-400.
But the US is worried about this.
Well,
so looking at the relationship, I mean, the two counterparts have fairly good relationship behind closed doors, as we hear, but can personal bonds overcome this month-long crisis?
Well, at the end of the day, somehow this relationship needs to survive. We're both NATO allies. Now, look, the Pentagon have been trying to frame this in a way that the purchase of the S-400 is not compatible with Turkey's commitments to NATO. And this is really not the case, because Secretary General Stoltenberg has said repeatedly that NATO member countries have a right to make their own defense procurement choices. And this is not a matter that NATO can interfere in. However, there's a desire on NATO's part to have interoperability of systems. It's not a complete requirement, it's a desire. So it's not a NATO rule that all systems purchased by a NATO member have to be interoperable with all NATO systems. However, the Americans, well, at least the military, have been framing it in this way, but it's not a NATO issue. In fact, if anything, I mean, my president said yesterday in one of his speeches that, Turkey is one of the countries that spends most on its defense expenditure in NATO after the United States. So it's totally unfair that we should have our NATO commitments questioned over the S-400. On the other hand, the Americans have also stated that they have a concern about the F-35 program and the S-400 being in the same country. And we said to them, look, if you have any technical concerns, let's form a technical committee where the technical experts can address all the issues that you raise and address them. And they didn't want to do that either. At the moment, the purchase has gone through, and components of the S-400 system are arriving according to schedule, and the system will be operational by the spring.
So we don't see the crisis solving now?
No, I mean, but the Americans have really gone about this the wrong way. Like, it's not really, it's been a rather sort of careless attitude, saying that we don't really care about the security requirements of Turkey, almost. This is almost the sort of line they're taking.
Let's get to Syria on that point you've raised, because all eyes are turned on Trump and Erdogan in what will happen with Syria. It's one of the main topics here at the UNGA. So do you see them putting their differences aside and meeting that timeline that Erdogan has given?
Well, actually, President Trump has already said that there ought to be a withdrawal of US troops from that area. That's what he desires. He's also agreed with President Erdogan on the establishment of a safe zone, and they've even talked about the depth of it, up to about 30 kilometers. So I don't think that the two presidents have a great deal of disagreement. But when it comes to the implementation, well, that has actually been a different story. You do know that we are cooperating with the American side, and the two militaries are now doing joint patrols with view of setting up this safe zone. However, it's not very helpful when we get statements coming out of the American military saying such things as, well, we have to take account of the requirements and to do this to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. Now, who are they referring to as the other party? It's a terrorist group that's attacking us, their NATO ally.
So
there is no way.
Is still the main.
Yeah, they can't equate a YPG, the terror group. They can't equate it with their NATO ally. And unfortunately, these statements are not helpful. That's the first thing. Second thing, these patrols and our verification of how much the YPG have withdrawn from these areas and so forth, it's going slow. So it's not satisfactory, the speed. On top of that, we have the example of Manbij, where we were given a promise that the YPG would leave that area, and they haven't. It's been over a year. So what we're saying is that we don't want this to turn into another Manbij. And we're ready to take our own action because we have to, because the YPG is the same as the PKK, and they are a threat, a serious national security threat to Turkey. And therefore, we are poised to take the necessary action if necessary. But we prefer to work with our allies.
So is there likely to be any unilateral military action?
Yes, because Turkey has made that very clear, that they would like that strip of that zone adjacent to our border to be patrolled and manned by the Turkish armed forces. They don't want other forces there. We don't want the YPG there. And the Americans are saying, oh, these are elements of the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're not really YPG, but we know who they are. And so this is not going to be a satisfactory solution for us. Now, the militaries are still working to iron things out. And of course, I think patience is running out. And President Erdogan has made it very clear that this action will take place if our expectations are not met. And I think when he does see President Trump, the message is going to be, we really need to come to a decision about this. So I think we're coming close to the end game, at least with regards to Turkish decisions regarding the northeast of Syria.
But that also brings us to the refugee crisis, especially in Idlib, because there will be another flow of refugees. And Erdogan made it very clear that there are problems in Idlib that will pose a migration threat to Turkey. Can you just talk more about that?
Not just a migration threat, a serious security threat. Look, we're already hosting about 3.9 million Syrians. Now, under the international legal agreements that we have, we're not supposed to take in asylum seekers from the east. So we have actually adapted our laws to give these people a status of temporary protection. But that's what it is, it's temporary protection. So it's not even legally sustainable. On top of that, of course, we've been taking care of these people who have fled their countries under terrible circumstances. And we've been praised by the international community for doing so in a really excellent manner. However, the strain is now beginning to show in society as well as on the economy. We've already spent a very large amount on taking care of the Syrian refugees. Europe, on the other hand, has hardly taken in any compared to the numbers we host. And the funds that the EU have promised, they haven't all been released to us. So there's also a growing frustration.
Which I believe Erdogan will make it quite clear here at the United Nations General Assembly, saying that it doesn't want to carry the burden by itself or shoulder it. Do you see the stance of Europe changing in that fact if Idlib is another threat?
Well, the Idlib threat is well, like I said, if Idlib, God forbid, should fall, we know that the Syrian regime, have no qualms about taking over the last deconfliction zone, which is Idlib, and they have no qualms about how they're going to take it over. They'll just kill as many civilians as they can. This will not only lead to an increase in radicalization in the area, but also an outpour of refugees, including radical elements among them, at our border. This is a serious security threat, and of course, it's also a burden we cannot bear. So this, at all costs, has to be avoided. But if Idlib should fall, it will also have terrible effects on the whole region, on everyone who wants this terrible war to end, and on the future of any settlement in Syria. So it's in the interests of all parties concerned, including the United States, to ensure that the Idlib agreement stays. And that's why our armed forces in those outposts are staying there at great risk to their lives, because their presence there is a huge deterrent. If those outposts should go, that's it, Idlib is gone. So I think it's also important.
You just mentioned all parties there. So when we're talking about all parties, we have Russia and Iran on one side.
Let me just finish that sentence. I just wanted to say that all parties should appreciate, including the United States, the sacrifices that the Turkish armed forces are making in that area. If we were not manning those outposts in Idlib, there would be utter chaos. So our contribution is also to the wider security of the region and all those concerned. Now, you wanted to ask me about the parties.
Yeah, especially because when we're talking about Russia and Iran, there's the Astana peace process. On the other side, we have the safe zone negotiations with the US. Where does it leave Turkey?
Well, Turkey, as you can see, is not only on the field, west and east, but it's also at various negotiating fora. But for Turkey, all of this...
Does it make it more difficult?
Well, it's actually... Well, everything we're facing is difficult. We're the ones with a 900-kilometer border. We're the ones who are facing a huge terrorist threat. We're the ones who are taking the brunt of all the weight of the refugee crisis. So for us, we are in the most difficult situation here, that's true. However, we are actively involved in all diplomatic efforts. So look, we just hosted the summit, the trilateral summit with the Astana 3 countries. And we all agreed that Idlib has to hold, and we have to find a way to make sure this ceasefire is sustainable. If it hadn't been for Astana, there wouldn't have been a humanitarian corridor out of Aleppo. Let's face it, these countries are on the ground. You have to work with countries that are there if you're going to get results. But moreover than that, we're interested in all of this supporting and feeding into a tangible process in Geneva. Without Astana, there would not be Geneva. It was Astana at the end that enabled the makeup of the Constitutional Committee. Yes, it was slow, but without Astana, you wouldn't have even got that far. So for us, everything feeds into Geneva, and we want to see a political settlement in Syria with the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria safeguarded as a whole.
And so far, has the United Nations General Assembly summit and your bilateral meetings been fruitful?
Yes, I think the more that we discuss, it helps. I mean, I was here before joining the President's entourage for the UN General Assembly, doing a number of meetings myself, and we did a number of panels talking to members of Congress. I mean, when we do put out these cases very, very clearly, and it's very obvious to us that people do value Turkey and Turkey's position as an important geostrategic partner in the Middle East, and Turkey as an island of stability. All of these things are valued. So we hear criticism, but we also hear the value that people here place on Turkey. So the more we talk, the more we have these dialogues at all levels, I think it's very healthy. Because it's only through that we can finally smooth out these differences, and I hope that we do. But like you said, now we're at the UN General Assembly, so where does all of this leave us? The main theme that the President is emphasizing at the UN, which carries on from all of these issues that we talked about, from the difficulties we face in the S-400, the difficulties with the terror threat we're facing next to the Syrian border, next to the Iraqi border, taking care of our own security with little reliance on allies, and the burden of the refugees we're facing. There's one theme that strings it all together, and that is injustice. So he's emphasizing injustice, but global injustice at the UN, because it's not just us. We're one country, obviously, that suffers from this more than others, but there is a general theme also of global injustice, which is very close to the President's heart. And he wants to address this, where there's so much suffering happening today. I mean, you look at all the things that are happening in the world. So every day the list of conflicts, potential conflicts, human suffering, it goes up. Every year, these themes, you add new ones onto them. 2 years ago, it was the Rohingya refugees. That's still there. They're still suffering. Now the Kashmir issue has exacerbated. That's, on the agenda. The safe zone, the return of refugees. So one of the other things that we want this safe zone for in northeast Syria is to ensure the safe return of refugees.
So the injustice brings me actually to Erdogan's statement, which he makes at United Nations General Assembly: the world is bigger than five, and that reform is needed. Why and how?
Well, I think the UN reform theme has been on the agenda with the President's speeches every time he comes here. He's not the only one. I think everyone in the world is aware that the UN needs reform. Now, the United Nations was formed at a time when the world was going through a transition after a great war. And injustices usually tend to happen during times of transition. They tend to increase, injustices increase in the world when the world is going through major transitions. And the United Nations was formed in 1945 to prevent the exacerbation of injustices at a time of transition. However, the world is going through another transition now. We find that the liberal world order that was established in 1945 is facing enormous challenges outside and within, and that the world is ideologically between those who would like to preserve that order and those who would like to have more protectionist measures and inward looking. So there's already a sort of grandiose ideological rift, but underneath all this we also have local conflicts exacerbating as societies and countries become more fragmented. So what we need is, during this time of transition, to address, as the UN, the issue of injustice, so that we can overcome the further exacerbation of these problems. But if the UN is not able to do this, then where else? Because the General Assembly, although it doesn't have the powers of the Security Council, is actually a very powerful body. There are so many nation states here that can actually come together at this time of the year and address these issues and talk about them. And I think that that's very important. And also on the sidelines, you have the bilaterals among leaders. So again, it's important for them to have that dialogue, to talk about these issues earnestly. We already see the Security Council is not functioning anymore because of the vetoes. So we need to find alternatives where international relations and relations between states can form mechanisms that ensure the delivery of justice. So I think everyone, regardless of differences we may have on details, is on the same page regarding that. So, and this is the essence of President Erdogan's statement about the world is bigger than five.
But as you mentioned yourself, we keep on talking about the same injustice every single year, and we add one on top of it. Looking at the flow of refugees, it's at a situation where it's worse than Second World War. So how do you see it happening? Do you see it happening?
Well, I think the injustices and all these different problems and crises are increasing every year precisely because of what I just said. We're going through a transition, a global transition. And the only way we can put an end to this is if we manage that transition together. Now, so far, rather than managing change, we seem to be encountering a resistance to change, particularly in the transatlantic relations, if you can, Europe and America. Rather than managing change, that resistance to change is actually creating more problems, because then there's another resistance to that resistance at local levels. So it just leads to instability. I think you could have a much more stable world if you could think outside the box, think outside the parameters of what was, I suppose, the re-establishment of the post-45 liberal order in the 1990s. Now, we're not in the 1990s anymore, and I think in some circles we're not aware that things have moved on. Sometimes I go to these think tank panels and you just listen to people as if they're still living in the 1990s, that the liberal world order has won and we have to safeguard these things and carry on. Of course we need to safeguard these values. They're very important. Human rights is important. Democracy is important. We live in a sort of, for Turkey, we're a sort of growing economy. We're an emerging market. Of course, we want to increase our trade volume with all countries that we have bilateral relations with. So we are in a competing global economy, and we want it that way. But these are all values that no one's against. But we really need to review our mechanisms for international cooperation. And I think this is the bottom line of what we're trying to address here at the UN.
So coming off from the topic from Syria and safe zones and S-400s, the main topic of the United Nations General Assembly is climate change. And it actually, after protests were held in many countries, it was marked with a special summit here. Do you believe that these discussions actually will make a difference, knowing that the US President Donald Trump has pulled out of the Paris Accord?
Yes, it's very, very unfortunate actually when a major, industrialized country like the United States is no longer part of the climate change accords. Of course, Turkey has been part of this, and we follow the negotiations very carefully, and we're supportive of this. We have to think also, why is this happening? Like all over Europe, for example, you see young people out there protesting about climate change, because as things get worse, in the long run, it's going to affect them, not us. And I think this is something that we really need to think about. Like, is climate change real? I mean, I know some people think it's a total hoax, but you can already see what's happening with the polar ice cap. And so there is a reality to it. We're not sure about timelines, and there are different timelines proposed by scientists, but the fact that it is happening somehow is a reality.
Well, we do have to wrap it up here, but it was a pleasure talking to you, Gulnur Aybet. Thank you.
Thank you very much.